Well, good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's Last Post ceremony. My name is Richard Cruz, and joining us today from the Australian Army is Private Lauren Drockman. We warmly welcome the family of Private Sibraa, whose story will be told shortly. We're honoured to acknowledge the Honourable Scott Morrison, Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Anthony Albanese, Leader of the Federal Opposition, and all members and senators of the 46th Parliament of Australia who are joining us this evening. We're also honoured to acknowledge His Excellency Mr Christophe Pernot, Ambassador of France to Australia, Mr Stephen Marshall, Premier of South Australia, General Angus Campbell, Chief of Defence Force, Vice Admiral David Johnston, Vice Chief of Defence Force, Mr Kerry Stokes, Chairman of the Council of the Australian War Memorial, and Dr Brendan Nelson, Director of the Australian War Memorial. As always, we welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. Today marks the 77th anniversary of the sinking of the Japanese merchant vessel, Montevideo Maru. When Rabaul fell to the Japanese in January 1942, more than 1,400 members of Australia's Lark Force were captured. Some 160 were killed shortly after the surrender. Later that year, on the 22nd of June, approximately 850 prisoners of war and 200 civilian internees were ordered by their Japanese captors to board the vessel Montevideo Maru. Tonight we'll hear the story of Private Lloyd Sylvester Sibraa and the loss of the Montevideo Maru, Australia's worst maritime disaster. Tonight is also the eve of the commencement of the 46th Parliament of Australia, the newly elected government chosen by the people of Australia. We pause here in the commemorative area of the Australian War Memorial to reflect on the political, economic and religious freedoms offered to us as Australians. These freedoms are underwritten by those who serve and have served our nation in the Australian Defence Force and the families who love and support them. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the pool of reflection by family and visitors to the memorial. Australia's Federation Guard will now dismount the catafalque party from the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier within the Hall of Memory.
party rest on!
I would now like to invite the Honourable Scott Morrison, Prime Minister of Australia, to the lectern.
Well, thank you very much, and can I extend a warm welcome to everyone who has joined us here this evening. In particular, can I acknowledge the traditional owners, the Ngunnawal people, their elders past and present and emerging. Can I also acknowledge any serving men and women who are here with us today, and indeed any veterans, and simply say, on behalf of a grateful nation, thank you for your service. In this place, our National War Memorial, the 102,000 men and women who have given their lives in the service of our country call us to live and believe in the future of our nation. Our inheritance is the result of their sacrifice, and our freedom a result of their selflessness. At this last post today, members and senators from the new Parliament, together with the public, gather to remember. And in this hallowed place, there is no Liberal, National, Labor, Green party affiliation. The only word that matters is one that unites us all: Australian. The only cause that we share today, Australia. We gather and we draw strength from the men and women whose names adorn the cloisters above. We are a country of memory, and it is right that every day this memorial reminds us of the stories of those who have gone before us. Today we will hear the story of Private Lloyd Sylvester Sibraa of the First Independent Company, one of over 1,000 Australians who would perish aboard the Japanese prison ship, the Montevideo Maru. Today marks 77 years to the day since this worst maritime loss in our nation's history. 1,000 Australians lost, among the 40,000 who would give their lives during the Second World War. Thousands of Australian prisoners of war were held on ships like the Montevideo Maru, the hell ships as they were known. Sickness and disease aboard these vessels were rife. People locked in the holds with little food, water or sanitation. 1,000 prisoners could be crammed into spaces meant for mere hundreds. All the while at constant risk of being attacked by submarines, for these vessels look no different than any other Japanese commercial vessel. 1,800 Australians would have perished aboard these hell ships. Yet these names fell out of memory. Montevideo Maru, Harugiku Maru, Rakuya Maru, Temehoka Maru, a hell ship that was sunk and those survivors were transported to Nagasaki. Last week marked 75 years since the Tomoko Maru sunk with 190 Australian prisoners of war lost. None of those Australians lost on the hell ships had burial places. And so this memorial is where they will be forever remembered. This is where families have honoured the memory of their own, touching the wall, kissing it, or leaving a poppy. And we remember those who remained and who were forever changed. Behind every name that surrounds us is a family, an Australian family, proud of their loved one's service, but never quite the same. There were mothers like Mary Keed. When collections came to the door and asked for donations to help build our local war memorial, she replied, "Sorry, not me. I already gave 4 sons." She would raise her grandson, Les. Les died aboard the Montevideo Maru. And widows like Catherine Russell. Her 7 sons signed up in the Second World War. 2 of them, Andrew and Charles, were on the Tomahawk Maru. Charles drowned when it sunk. Andrew was rescued after 11 hours in the water and delivered to a POW camp in Nagasaki, where he died from its cruelties months later. Their younger sister Dorothy would keep their photos by her bedside till the end of her days. We also remember Mark and Jessie Turner, who lost 3 sons, Sid, Dudley and Darryl, on the Montevideo Maru. Sid and Dudley Turner were especially protective of their younger brother Darryl. He was just 17. They enlisted together and they were all selected for the first independent company. They kept their promise to stay together and watch over young Darryl until they all perished together. Their father, Mark Turner, withdrew from society, and their mother Jessie would wear her government-issued silver badge with 3 stars, one for every son killed, until the day she passed away. These are the casualties of war we don't see. These stories are not just relics of the past. They live with us as they should today. As long as there is Australia, and that will be forever, our people will never forget the sacrifice of those who served in our name to establish it. And as long as we are a free nation, the men and women of our Parliament will come here to draw strength, as we do this evening, from those who served, lest we forget.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I now invite the Honourable Anthony Albanese, Leader of the Federal Opposition, to the lectern.
I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land and pay my respect to their elders, past and present. To Prime Minister Morrison and parliamentary colleagues. To the Memorial Chair, Kerry Stokes, to the Memorial Director, Dr. Brendan Nelson. We want to acknowledge also serving and former ADF personnel who are here this sunset. We especially welcome the relatives of Private Sibraa who are in attendance here this evening. The nation-building generation which designed our national capital never planned on building a war memorial, but the optimistic and growing nation of 1911, which accepted Walter Burley Griffin's plan for Canberra, had, by 1927, become a grieving nation when Emil Soderstone and John Crust were invited to design an Australian war memorial for this very site. Of course, Australians had fought and died for our country at home and abroad long before the First World War. But the war that came in 1914 changed us forever. We will never know what this nation might have become if the leaders of the world had found a way to avoid the First World War, or to stop fascism before it rearmed, or to prevent any of the other wars in the centuries since. We will never know what long lives the 60,000 Australians who had died in the war by 1918 might have lived. We'll never see the trees that they might have planted, the great works that they might have built, importantly, the families that they might have raised, or what different lives the 156,000 Australians who were wounded, gassed, or taken prisoner might have lived. There is one thing that we do know. The selfless sacrifice of generations of Australians secured the freedom that we enjoy in this nation today, and for that we give thanks. They defended the values upon which this nation was built. On the very day that this memorial opened, Prime Minister John Curtin said this: The Parliament of a free people deliberates day by day and cannot but be inspired and strengthened in the performance of its great duty by the ever-present opportunity to contemplate the story that has gone before them of the deed that helped make the nation, and of the unifying purpose which links the ordered ways of a free people with that matchless courage which inspires its sons to maintain it. The Parliamentary Labor Party that John Curtin once led, the party which I lead today, remains deeply inspired by the courage with which Australia's sons and daughters still defend us. The cruel world war that demanded the memorialisation of so much pain ended in 1918, but the grief never did. My old friend Kim Beazley reminds me that in Sydney, at the end of that war, 10,000 women dressed in black marched to the walls where they had last seen their husbands, their sons, their lovers, their brothers, and there they threw flowers into the waters. A sobering thought. But while the human tragedy of that time might seem distant, it is closer than we might think. The footsteps of those we have lost echo down the years. Each year, I'm sure, along with other parliamentarians, I'm privileged to address Anzac Day ceremonies in my electorate. I take time to have a look at the records of locals who served. Those records allow us to learn some of the stories of the men and women who have served our nation in times of conflict. It's why this memorial is so important. This year at the service at Balmain, I spoke of the sacrifice of Henry Drysdale, who lost his life in July 1918 at Villers-Bretonneux, just months before the guns finally fell silent. Henry was from Balmain. He walked the streets where I walk my entire life. After my speech, a young woman approached me and introduced herself. Her name was Kira. She lives in Balmain. She is Henry Drysdale's great-grandniece. Like Kira and her family, we must never forget. As we enjoy the wonderful opportunities that our nation offers us, we must take the time to reflect upon how our nation was built. And that is what we do here at Sunset. But it's not enough to remember. The grief of war darkens too many Australian lives. We must dedicate ourselves to do all we can to keep peace in our world. We have much work to do. We must also understand that when lives are turned upside down in our defence, we must gently and carefully help our veterans come to terms with their experience. Our care must be ongoing. When I hear the last post, my heart sinks. I think of the human cost of war, the nature of sacrifice and the desirability of peace. But with sorrow comes something else, pride. The pride of knowing that we live in a free nation among a people who value freedom and are willing to defend it for themselves, for their families, and for their nation, lest we forget.
Thank you, Mr. Albanese. If you're able, I invite you all to please stand and join in singing the national anthem.
Turn. Party present. Arms.
Australians, oh, let us rejoice, for we are young and free. We've golden soil and well
If you're able, please be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn their loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight we'll read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection in the following order. The family of Private Lloyd Sylvester. The Honourable Scott Morrison, Prime Minister of Australia, and the Honourable Anthony Albanese, Leader of the Federal Opposition. The Honourable Tony Smith, Speaker of the House of Representatives, and Senator the Honourable Scott Ryan, President of the Senate. Mr Stephen Marshall, Premier of South Australia. Senator the Honourable Linda Reynolds, Minister for Defence, and the Honourable Richard Miles, Shadow Minister for Defence. The Honourable Darren Chester, Minister for Veterans and Defence Personnel, and the Honourable Shane Newman, Shadow Minister for Veterans Affairs and Defence Personnel. General Angus Campbell, Chief of Defence Force. Senator the Honourable Alex Hawke, Assistant Minister for Defence, and Mr Pat Conroy, Shadow Minister, Assisting for Defence. The Honourable Melissa Price, Minister for Defence and Industry, and Mr Matt Keogh, Shadow Assistant Minister for Defence Industry. Senator the Honourable Simon Birmingham on behalf of the Minister for Foreign Affairs, and Senator the Honourable Penny Wong, Opposition Leader in the Senate, Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs. Mr Brett Gallagher, Chief Commissioner of the Salvation Army's Red Shield Defence Service. Mr Kerry Stokes, Chairman of the Council of the Australian War Memorial, and Dr Brendan Nelson, Director of the Australian War Memorial. Mr Max Utridge, President, Papua New Guinea Association of Australia, Miss Andrea Williams, Chair, Rabaul and Montevideo Maru Group, and Mr Michael White, Rabaul Historical Society. Mr John Reeves, New Guinea Volunteer Rifles and Papua New Guinea Volunteer Rifles Ex-Members Association, and Dr Lewis Drew, the 2nd 22nd Battalion Lark Force Association. And our final reads this evening will be laid by visitors to the memorial.
Today, we remember and pay tribute to Private Lloyd Sylvester Sibraa. Lloyd Sibraa was born in the Sydney suburb of Forest Lodge on the 9th of June 1919, the son of Neville and Mabel Sibraa. Neville and Mabel separated early in their marriage. Lloyd grew up to work as a station hand and a drover around Ford's Bridge on the Darling River, collecting a fierce abdominal scar as a reminder of a horse kick during his employment. After a period of part-time service with the Australian Military Forces, he was discharged in order to join the Permanent Forces at the age of 21. Initially allotted to an anti-aircraft regiment, Sibraa attended artillery school at Georges Heights. Returning to camp, he was found absent without leave in January 1941 and was later discovered asleep on guard duty. He was confined to barracks as punishment for each incident. In April 1941, he was classified as a driver-mechanic, and the following month transferred to the 1st Independent Company, one of 12 independent or commando companies raised for service in the Second World War. In June, Sibraa had pre-embarkation leave, and in July he left Australia, bound for New Guinea. As the threat of war with Imperial Japan loomed, most of the 1st Independent Company was sent to protect Kavyang Airfield. In the event of invasion, the Australians were under orders to resist long enough to destroy key airfields and other military installations, and then withdraw south to wage a guerrilla war. On the 21st of January 1942, a bombing raid by about 60 Japanese aircraft attacked Kavyang. While a number of aircraft were shot down, the company's means of escape, the schooner Induna Star, was damaged. The crew managed to sail the vessel to Kout and started to repair the damage, as the commandos withdrew across New Britain, having received word that a large Japanese naval force was approaching. In the early morning of the 22nd of January 1942, the Japanese landed at Kavyang Airfield. Fighting broke out there as the small force that had remained behind blew up the supply dump and other facilities. Fighting their way out, the commandos withdrew towards the main force at Sook, although a number of men were captured in the process. Around this time, contact with Private Sibraa was lost. He was declared missing, believed to be a prisoner of war. On the 24th of November 1945, a memorial notice in the Herald read that Gunner Lloyd Sibraa was presumed lost at sea. He had been last reported on the Japanese prison ship Montevideo Maru, among the group of approximately 850 military prisoners and 200 civilian internees who had been ordered to board the ship on the morning of the 22nd of June. 8 days into the voyage to Hainan, the Montevideo Maru, which had no markings to indicate it was carrying prisoners, was spotted by the American submarine, the USS Sturgeon, which manoeuvred into position to fire its stern torpedoes. Survivors from the Montevideo Maru's Japanese crew reported 2 torpedoes striking the vessel, followed by an explosion in the oil tank in the aft hold. The vessel sank in as little as 11 minutes. Of those aboard, barely 20 Japanese crew survived. Over 1,000 others died. According to a surviving Japanese crewman, Australians in the water sang Auld Lang Syne to their trapped mates as the ship sank beneath the waves. This sinking is considered the worst maritime disaster in Australia's history. Unaware of the ship's losses, the families of those on the Montevideo Maru continued to send letters in belief that their loved ones were being held as prisoners of war. It was not until after the war that they discovered the fate of those lost on the Montevideo Maru. Sibraa's mother clung to the hope that he had somehow made it and kept the army informed of her address, lest Lloyd should have survived. On the 1st of July, 1947, Sibraa's mother placed a notice in the Sydney Morning Herald, which read, "At night when shadows are falling, and I am all alone, there comes that longing, Lloydie, if you could just come home." Lloyd Sibraa was 23 years old. Today, he is commemorated at the Rabaul Memorial and the Rabaul and Montevideo Memorial here at the Australian War Memorial. His name is also listed on the Roll of Honour on my left among almost 40,000 Australians who died serving in the Second World War. His photograph is displayed today beside the Pool of Reflection. This is but one of many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Private Lloyd Sylvester Sibraa, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
If you're able, please stand for the reading of the ode and the sounding of the last post.
Party shoulder. Arms.
They shall not grow old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Catapult Party present. Arms. Party shoulder. Arms.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget.
Catapult Party in words. Turn. Catapult Party quick. March.
We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Poziere or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes this evening's last post ceremony. We thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.